but that her granddaughters were able to go. The mother of the granddaughter was saved at a very early age and was really quite, involved in church and married on St. God. But anyway, she was thrilled. So they had 4 one night and 6 the next night, which is not very many. I mean, we had big groups, but it's the first in 10 years or 11 years. So hopefully, next year it'll be, more will come out and there'll be something good will come out of even this.
Yeah, the church up there. Yeah.
They've done something.
Let me just add this up here because I know some of you are writing these down to continue to pray for during the week. And I know on Wednesday night, it's on the list for Wednesday night, and we keep them there because I know they've been on your heart for a long time. Well, probably before that, but since 2012, exactly. Yeah. Yes. Okay, definitely. Good to hear the report of what's happening up there too. That's good. Okay, we got 5 verses to get through, and we were gonna go right through them because I couldn't put this together. And this morning I woke up at 5 o'clock and it dawned on me what I was missing in this, because sometimes we go through these verses, and especially this set of verses that we're going to go through. We jump into these verses. Morning. Glad you guys are here. All right. He cleaned up a little bit from yesterday. Yeah, I know. Yeah, I was a mess yesterday. So sometimes we look at scripture, we jump into it, and it's like we read a set of verses and it's like, okay, I know what to do with these verses because it's clear. Kind of. At least that's what we think we should do with them. And that's where I was stuck on these verses. We're going to look at Galatians chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. That's what we're going to go through today. And even when I backed up and I said, Paul didn't write Galatians chapter 6, verse 1 through 5 by itself. Nobody says, I'm going to write the end of this letter first because I want something to say. Pretty much, when you write a letter, you start at the beginning and you kind of run through this letter until you get to the end. And sometimes you got some straggler stuff that you want to close up on. And so those kind of pieces come together. And that's what I thought was happening here in Galatians chapter 6, that Paul was like, okay, I said what I wanted to say. Now there's some stuff that I want to, some other stuff that's on my mind that I just want to communicate. And I struggle with that for a long time because that's usually not the case. Sometimes, but usually when you're going through and you're putting stuff down, there's a reason that what you're putting this down, there's a reason, and it's usually connected to kind of what you've been talking about. And so even when I started with this 1 through 5 going, I was having trouble connecting the dots. So let's back up to what we started with last several weeks ago. And so, the chapters and verses, Paul didn't put those chapter and verse marks on them. We put those marks on later just so we could find where we were looking at. But Paul wrote this letter front to back, no chapter, no verse marks. And so anytime you read stuff, I highly encourage you to take out all the verse markers and all the chapter markers and back up and read it as a continuous thought, okay? This one here, as we do it, it looks like there might be a break, but I don't think so. Let's read through that. Okay, so I'm going to put this up here so we can kind of read through it. I have to have my glasses on because otherwise I can't see my computer. So let's back up into Galatians chapter 5, into a common piece of Galatians chapter 5, the fruit of the Spirit. And we usually pull that out and say the fruit of the Spirit, and that's a thing that we talked about, but we've kind of gone through that to say, there's a reason he was talking about the fruit of the Spirit and what does that mean in context with the whole letter that he was writing. So we're not going to get into that because that took us a while to get through, but we're going to start there. So let's read from Galatians chapter 6, verse 22. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such, there is no law. Those who belong to Jesus Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. Since we live by the Spirit, let us keep in step with the Spirit. Let us not become conceited, provoking and envying each other. Brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. But watch yourselves, or you also may be tempted. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. If anyone thinks they are something when they are not, they deceive themselves. Each one should test their own actions. Then they can take pride in themselves alone without comparing themselves to someone else, for each one should carry their own load. Nevertheless, the one who receives instruction in the word should share all good things with their instructor. Okay, so that is kind of what we're talking about. We're going to look at those middle verses in there. That idea of, brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently, but watch yourself. Okay, before we jump into that, how many of you were ever 20-something? Now,
how many
a
times?
harder question. So now the harder question. How many of you remember when you were 20-something? Oh, all right, Jim does. Okay, good. And Linda does too. Okay. It's getting further and further away from me. Sorry, 20s. But I know this. When I was 20-something, I was moving out of the house. And my parents are here, and so I got to be careful what I say. I was moving out of the house. And I'll bet it was the same for you. When you were moving out from your parents and you were becoming on your own, you didn't say, my parents' rules, all of my parents' rules, I just can't wait to implement them myself. That's how I'm going to live, by my parents' rules. Now, I didn't. Maybe you did. Probably. I don't know. Did anybody think that? Yeah, I didn't think so. Okay. When we moved out, when we were 3, when we were 8, when we were 15, whose rules did we live by? Our own? No. Parents' rules, right? What mom and dad said went. Now, most families, there's usually, well, can I say this? I'm going to say it anyway. Most families, one of the parent is the rule maker. And there's the other parent that, if I want something, I go to mom. Or I go to dad. It can be either way. It's not always the same. But usually there's one that is, these are the rules. And the other is, but sometimes it's both of them. Sometimes these are the rules. And as you're growing up, you live by the rules. You don't have to like them, but that's what you do. You live by the rules. And when you get to 20-something, you move out. Now, some of us may have, like, I was 16 or I was 18, I'm gone. And guess what? I'm never living by those rules again.
Yeah, I'll join the Marines so I don't have to do that.
Okay. That solved one problem. I'm betting it didn't solve all those problems. But regardless, it's that idea that, and some kids, as they're growing up, they really push hard against those rules that they had to live by. And some of our kids, some of us maybe, when we got out from under those rules, what did we do? Or what did our kids do? Went off the rails. I mean, broke all the rules. It's like, I don't have to live by those rules anymore. I can do anything I want now, as long as I don't get caught and go to jail. And some kids, that's not even a deterrent. I mean, they really go off the rails. And as parents looking at our kids, it's heartbreaking. And internally, if it was one of us going off the rails, we are just living life because we can, and we're all sitting here. So I'm assuming at some level, if we went off the rails, we kind of came back and we got ourselves on to some level of rails, because we're here on a Sunday morning at 10 and something. So at some level, we've actually kind of got ourselves back, even if we totally went off the rails. But if our kids are off the rails, it's heartbreaking. And it's a weird thing, and we've talked about this in the last number of weeks, in that idea of we can live by a set of rules. And as our kids growing up, we understand it's harder to see as our parents that, okay, they had a set of rules, and as we're kids, we want to live by those rules. More, it was like, my parents set these rules up that kind of didn't make any sense, but I have to live with them until I can get rid of them and I can do my own thing. But as parents, it's kind of the other side of things. It's like, I'm trying to put these rules together so that my kids grow up well. And so we put these rules around so that our kids know what's right and wrong, and just do the rules and your life will be good. And it's like, and they grow up and they move out, and all of a sudden we don't understand why they took all these rules, and they're doing their own thing. And my kid gets a tattoo, and it's like, what happened? I had these rules. If they just followed the rules, their life wouldn't be like going off the rails like I see it, and it's heartbreaking. But we're caught in this idea of, if they would just follow the rules, life would be good. But that gets us back to Galatians, because that's right where Paul was, and what's happening in the church at this time. There's this big shift happening, and we're seeing it in Sunday morning, but we're seeing it in Galatians really starkly. That idea that Paul is telling the church as a whole, guess what? It's not the rules. Following the law that God gave us and is good, but following the law isn't how we live anymore. We need to live by the Spirit. And that complicates things a lot. Because when we say live by the Spirit, what's that mean? Wait a minute. I have the Spirit living inside of me. Did the Old Testament believers have the Spirit living inside of them? No. So they didn't have this option of live by the Spirit. They had the idea of, here's God's rules that he gave us, live by the rules. And we see in the New Testament church that the Old Testament, these Jews that are now accepting Christ as their Savior, are like, great. And we got the Spirit living inside of us. Whoa. Not only am I God's people, But now I'm God's people and the Spirit is living inside of me. This is amazing. But we saw that odd transition happen where Peter was like, go to Cornelius' house? We don't do that. Gentile? We don't go to the Gentiles. And we see that whole idea as the church is shifting to, wait a minute, it's not God's people, the Jews. God's people is anybody who believes that Christ, that Jesus was the Messiah, and he was God, and he came and he paid for our sin. This whole idea shifted on its head. But not only that, but now we have this the Spirit living inside of us. And we need to be following the lead of the Spirit in our lives. And so it gave the early church a problem, because it's like, do I still need to be circumcised? God said in the Old Testament, if you're going to be my people, you will be circumcised. If you're not circumcised, you're not my people. God said, follow these rules. He gave them this whole, not just the 10 Commandments. He gave them a whole mess of rules. He said, follow the rules, not just the do's and don'ts, but observe these days and all of this stuff. So the Jews had this whole package of, this is what we do to be God's people. And so now they're in the New Testament church and they're like, okay, Gentiles, great. We're all accepting that Jesus is the Messiah, but be circumcised. Observe these days. Follow the rules. And Paul is saying, no, it's changed. This is a new dispensation. This is a new way that God is working with his people. It's no longer following the rules. And he talks about in Galatians that idea of, did you get the Spirit by following the law? No. It's different now. You need to follow the Spirit, because the Spirit is living inside of each of us. And we need to follow the lead of the Spirit. And we've been talking about that for the last several weeks. That idea of, what's it mean to follow the lead of the Spirit in our lives? And it's not easy. But that is New Testament Christianity. That is what it means to be a follower of Christ now, is following the lead of the Spirit. That gives us a big problem. Because if it's not following the rules, it's following the lead of the Spirit. We now understand what Paul is saying in Romans, right? Where he says, the things that I desire to do, I don't do. And the things I know I shouldn't do, I do them. Oh, this is hard. This is hard. Not only is it difficult, but it now becomes a little bit even more difficult, because if all we had to do was follow the rules that God put in the Old Testament for us, I can do that, and I know what I have to do, and I can help you do that. Be circumcised. Observe the Sabbath. It's the set of rules. I can see if you're... Now, the Pharisees totally messed that up. And they said, let me help you follow all of the rules that we're making up, that are based on what God told us. So there was a problem there, and Jesus gave the Pharisees some grief for that. Of you are making these things up. That is not what God meant when he put these rules in place for us. But God did put the rules in place for us. And Paul tells us, is the law bad? No, the law is good. But we're still working on this other side of it. What's it mean to live by the Spirit as opposed to following the law? And we also know with our kids, and we'll use kids as an example. We could use personal example of, but it's easier to see with our kids. And I'll use, just leave it there. Okay. My kids, as my kids grow up and move out of the house, and they're now out, both married, gone, kind of. But they're both moved out. Okay, so they're both married. They've got their own lives that they're putting their own lives together and all that kind of stuff. Yes. I don't want them to take all of my rules and live by my rules now. Well, kind of I do, but not really. I want them to struggle with this idea of the Spirit is living in their life and they are following the lead of the Spirit. That's really what I want. I want God to be working in their hearts, and I want them to have that same struggle that Paul has. I know what's right, and I struggle choosing to do what's right, but I know what's right, and that's what I want. And I know what the Spirit is leading me not to do, and I don't want to do those things. And yeah, I struggle with that. Sometimes I do things that I shouldn't do. I want them to have that struggle inside. And I want them to be working through that struggle just like each of us. And hopefully, each of us isn't doing that struggle like we did when we were 20. Hopefully, each of us is kind of a little bit past that, and we're closer to getting life figured out and doing things better than we were when we were 20. I'm not sure all of us are there, but a lot of us have been moving. That's good. Personally, I struggle with some of that. I still do. Anyway, I want the Spirit working in their lives, and I want them to struggle that way as they are maturing and they're being sanctified as God is working in their lives and they're moving towards the direction. Now, it's really easy as a parent for me to jump in and help the Spirit do his work for him. I don't know if any of you struggle with that, but it's so easy when I see my kids do something that is clearly wrong. So give them grief and let them know this is the Spirit talking. This is what you should be doing. And I have to stop myself sometimes and say, no, I want my kids to wrestle with the lead, be in step with the Spirit and following the lead of the Spirit. And I want to be their encourager now, as opposed to their rule maker. And how to make that shift as a parent is not easy. And each kid requires a little bit different interaction. And some of you are in that same space of kind of figuring that piece out. But the goal is not for my kids to live with my set of rules. Now, when they come to my house and they load the dishwasher, I got a set of rules, okay? This is what goes in the bottom. This is the order it goes. These are the way the silverware goes. And I can tell when somebody else loads the dishwasher, oh my goodness, it's mayhem. And if they just followed my rules, it would be so much easier unloading that dishwasher as opposed to figuring out every time, what is that and why is it there? We have rules that we want our kids to live by, but as they mature, as they're little, it's important that we help them understand you've got to live by rules. But as they mature, as they accept Christ in their life, and they get the Spirit living inside of them, even young kids have the Spirit living in their lives, we want to train them up to not say, the rest of your life, I want you to live by my rules. We want them to mature and understand the Spirit's lead and live by the Spirit impact in their life. So as we kind of go through that idea of each of us struggling with that idea of it's not following the rules, it's following the lead of the Spirit. That is where we get into this morning's material. Because now we have to deal with that idea of each of us is responsible for following the lead of the Spirit in our lives and making choice, being in step with the Spirit work in my life. I'm not responsible for being in step with the Spirit's work in your life. I'm responsible for being in step with the Spirit's work in my life. And we are at different places. And trust me, if I was struggling, how do I say this right? Say it this way. I know in my life at 60 that there are things that I struggle with. There are things in my life that I know I'm not doing correctly. There are things in my life that I don't even know yet that I'm not doing correctly. So let me say it this way. If I fully understood everything in my life that I was doing wrong, that wasn't aligned with what God's ultimate purity standard is, that would probably be overwhelming. Just saying. And I can tell you for sure, when I was 20, if I understood everything that I've been sanctified from through so far, and I've made some progress this direction, although I'm not there yet, if I understood all of it, I'm sure it would have been overwhelming. So we each are at different places as we are moving along, becoming more sanctified. And my job is not to struggle with what you're struggling with. My job is to struggle with what I'm struggling with. Okay. That being said, so this idea of living by the Spirit is a little bit complicated. Now, one more thing that we got to throw into this mix. And this makes these verses additionally difficult to talk about here. Okay. And that is, we have all been, well, I don't know about all of us. Most of us have been raised in a very American-centric culture. And what I mean by that is most of us are very individualistic. Most of us have been taught actively that we need to rely on ourselves to live. we need to be responsible individually for ourselves. Now, not all cultures are that way. There are a number of cultures that are a lot more collective. We, as a group, work together. As a group, we interact for the common groupness as opposed to the individualness. America is very individual-centric. And there's goods and bads about that, just so you know. In this case, it becomes a little bit more complicated because one of the things that we struggle with as individuals is we don't rely on each other very well. We don't work together very well. We think we do, and in some ways we do, but we aren't dependent on each other very well. And we don't let ourselves be dependent on each other. And if I had to be dependent on Christian, that would make me really, really uncomfortable. No sense on you. Not Christian, on any of you. The point is if I have to be dependent on anybody else, that makes me really uncomfortable. Now, that's not true in all cultures, but in our culture, it's very true that we don't like being dependent on anybody. Matter of fact, I've got tools at my house. I got stuff at my house that I don't need. Well, I need them, but I bought them. You know why I bought them? I bought them so I didn't have to borrow it from my neighbor. I bought them so I didn't have to call one of you and say, I know you've got a pressure washer, and there's many of you have pressure washers. I know there are other people with pressure washers, and does it make sense for me to go buy my own pressure washer when I could call one of you up and say, hey, can I borrow your pressure washer? No. No, it doesn't. Why did I buy my own pressure washer?
Prideful to borrow.
So I didn't have to call Jerry up and say, Jerry, can I borrow your pressure washer? I'm independent. I don't need to rely on Jerry. I want to do it myself. That happens all over the place where we don't want to be dependent on each other. And what that does is it keeps us at some level of distance from each other, right? Because if I needed to be dependent on borrowing Jerry's pressure washer, that means that I've got to relate with Jerry differently. Now I don't have to. I got my own pressure washer. I don't have to call Jerry. I don't have to go out to lunch with Jerry. It keeps us distance from each other because I'm not willing to rely on each other. And that has a really devastating effect as Christians. Because as this group right here, are we called to interact with each other? Are we called to support each other? Would Jerry loan me his pressure washer if I needed it? Yes. Is there any question in my mind that Jerry would have any hesitation at helping me? No. So what am I doing when I'm saying, no, I don't want to be dependent on somebody else? I'm keeping myself separate in ways that I should not be doing. I should be looking at this idea as a group of people, as a group of believers right here. How can I support being dependent on each other? How can I support relating with each other? How can I support actually spending more time working with each other? And it's not easy. It's painful. But that's what we're called to do, because we see that in a number of places. This is just going to be one of them as we get into this. And that's why I said I thought it was going to be done in 1 week, and it's going to take me 2.
You need to get started.
That's right. But I started. I even read the passage, okay? So we're definitely started. This idea of being dependent on each other, when we're called in Hebrews, we could talk about a whole mess of verses, but we are supposed to be relating with each other and spurring it and encouraging each other and encouraging each other to love and good works. And we could go to, I don't know how many passages, and look at that idea. What's it take as a group of believers here, as a local church, that we need to be helping each other and working with each other and relating with each other? And that doesn't happen by showing up here on Sunday morning and saying, hi, by the way, you're sitting in my pew. It doesn't work by just saying hi to each other on Sunday mornings. It takes a lot more than just seeing each other once a week, or even multiple, or even showing up on, even if I showed up every single service, prayer meeting, Sunday morning worship, I'm there for all of them. And every time I say, hi, how you doing? And we all know the right answer to that, right? Just fine, exactly. I'm doing great. I'm doing better than just fine. I'm doing great, okay? Because I don't want the follow-on question if I don't say I'm doing great, okay? So even then, even if we see each other and we have these cursory interactions, we are not getting to a level of interaction that we're called to. I can't help you in your walk with Christ if I don't know you more than seeing you on Sunday morning. If we are not living life together, all we're doing is saying, I'm doing fine, and if you're not doing fine, I'll pray for you all week. That's all I want to know. That's not what we're called to, though. So we're called to this past the idea of just knowing each other. We're called to live life together. Now, as we have that model, that idea in mind of we are called to live life together, and we're called to all of what that means to live life together, now we can start talking about Galatians chapter 6 again. And so we'll do that next week. Almost made it. Okay, so next week we're going to take that next step, and we're going to look at these verses of brothers and sisters. If someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently, and we'll go from there. But this is not just simple, because sometimes we like to read this right up front and we do a cursory, oh, that's clearly related to what Paul was telling the Corinthian church of that believer that was living in sin. Kick him out, because that's the easy one. I see this guy is sinning, let me fix it for him. It's a lot more nuanced than that. And so next week, we'll dive into that one a little bit more and say, okay, let's look at what Paul was meaning as he was working through this letter to the churches in the Galatia region. And what was he encouraging them to do as part of this whole letter that he's given them? Okay, let's close in prayer. Father, thank you for this opportunity to get together as believers who love you, friends who have this heart's desire to be led by your Spirit. We thank you for that. And I pray as we do this, that we would become closer to you and that we would know how to support each other in our walk with you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, thank you much.
Thank you for joining us today. I hope that the service was a blessing, that all of it, the music, the